Welcome to the Benson Wealth Podcast. I take complex financial and economic topics and make it accessible to the everyday listener. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Benson Wealth Podcast. My name is Drew Benson. I am the president and founder of Benson Wealth Management, and I'm a senior wealth advisor with Raymond James. In addition to that, I'm also the co-managing partner for True North Wealth Management Group, which is a platform for independent wealth advisors. I'm a former economist, and currently I'm a certified financial planner and wealth advisor. So today I had Don Boudreaux back on the podcast. As a reminder, Don is a professor and economist at George Mason University. And today we really did a deep dive on trade policy and tariffs. I think you'll find this very enlightening and fascinating. And I want to say this before you get into this episode, that I learned a lot of very interesting facts about trade policy and about exports and imports that blew my mind today and really opened my eyes to what a good trade policy could look like. We talk about the impacts of trade policy. We talk about the current administration. And then even though some of this may feel a little down in terms of the economic blows that can come from trade wars, we do end the episode with a whole lot of hope for the future of the economy and for the investors. So I hope you enjoy. I loved this conversation, and I really enjoy speaking to Don. Don, thanks for coming back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Drew. I appreciate it.
It's always good to see you. I've enjoyed our prior conversations, and I've been eager to talk to you today about trade policy.
I always like talking about trade policy, and there's a lot to
talk about these
days.
There sure is. So let's start, I'd say, from the high level, right? Like, what is your general take on the idea of using tariffs as a way to protect an economy? So what would you say are the economic impact, thinking of economics in a vacuum, what would be the impact of tariffs on a macroeconomy?
Bad.
Okay.
The tariffs, so when we're talking about tariffs, we're talking about protective tariffs. So let's make a distinction between protective tariffs and revenue tariffs, because people get confused on this. A protective tariff, which is the kind of tariffs Trump likes, given what he says. These are tariffs designed to protect American industry, to protect American jobs, to protect American production from foreign competition. By their nature, they have to raise the prices of things that Americans buy from abroad. That's the only way tariffs can work to protect an American worker. If the tariffs don't raise those prices, then the American worker is not protected. And so protective tariffs are designed to reduce America. So we're talking about America as the home country, obviously. So protective tariffs in America are designed to reduce Americans' access to goods and services from abroad. That means they reduce Americans' access to goods and services. You don't make a country wealthier. You don't increase the standard of living of the people in that country by reducing their access to goods and services. So that's a pretty simple way to say it. Material prosperity is greater and greater access to material goods and services. Trade is a mechanism for gaining greater access to material goods and services. Protective tariffs are designed to restrict our access to material goods and services. Therefore, protective tariffs make us less wealthy. Now, what protectionists will say in response is, oh, that's a short-run view. You see, the purpose of the tariff, at least the most general purpose of the tariff, is to stimulate domestic production to be higher than what it would otherwise be, so in the long run, we'll be made better off. And the economist says, well, resources aren't free. You can indeed protect a handful of industries. If tariffs are slapped on steel, tariffs are slapped on automobile tires, you can increase American production of steel and automobile tires, but the workers and the resources that go to produce those extra amounts of steel and extra automobile tires have to come from somewhere. And so outputs elsewhere in the economy fall. We have very good reason for believing that in a free competitive market with government not intervening, market prices and profits and losses and other market signals direct resources into those uses in which they're most productive and away from uses at which they're less productive. And so what protective tariffs do is increase production in industries in which the country has a comparative disadvantage, industries in which we don't operate very efficiently, by drawing resources away from industries in which we operate efficiently. Well, when you draw resources away from efficient uses toward inefficient uses, you get less output from those resources. And when you get less output from those resources, you get a smaller economic pie. And so there's just no salvaging economically the economic case for protective tariffs. Protectionists, I'll stop rambling here in just a moment, Drew. Protectionists,
this is good.
Have they actually amuse me quite often, because they often they when they hear this explanation, they'll say, "Oh, well, you economists haven't thought about X, Y, and Z." Well, we economists have thought about X, Y, and Z for centuries. Adam Smith, the first real economist, thought about most X, Ys, and Zs. And the few X, Ys, and Zs that Adam Smith didn't think about were mentioned early on by protectionists. So economists in the 19th century, 20th century, 21st century have been compelled to think about X, Ys, and Zs. And so we've thought about them, and we've dealt with them all. So we don't have time here to run through, every objection to the free trade. What about infant industries? What about dumping? What about retaliatory tariffs? We can do that. And we economists have, I think, very good answers to those replies. But to get back to the original question, the general proposition of protectionism is that you make a country richer by restricting its access to goods and services. And that's just a silly proposition. It does not work.
So one of the pushbacks, Don, is going to be, well, there's national security concerns. Mm-hmm. So, okay, maybe everything is correct of what you're saying about tariffs, but is there an argument to be made for, say, the fact that most semiconductors are made in Taiwan, or the fact that, to my understanding, most pharmaceutical products are made in China? Are we exposing ourselves to geopolitical or national security risk by not bringing some of that industry back? That's the argument. I'm not saying I advocate it, but that's the argument. What would you say to that?
So before we get to national security, you mentioned pharmaceuticals, and almost everything can have some national security impact: food, clothing, rubber bands, pharmaceuticals. But on pharmaceuticals, I'll talk about national security in just a moment. It is true that in volume, we get most physical weight or mass. The bulk of, or China is the single largest supplier of American pharmaceuticals. In value, China is the 7th largest supplier of American pharmaceuticals. By far, the largest supplier of American pharmaceuticals is Ireland. We get 5 times more value of pharmaceuticals from Ireland than we do from China. If you look at the top 10 sources of American pharmaceuticals today, and this is data from 2024, or 2023, but I'm pretty sure it's relevant for 2025. Again, China's number 7. The countries include Ireland, which is number 1, the UK, Germany, Denmark, Sweden. China is the only non-democratic country. The only other country that you might describe as potentially non-free is India. It's democratic, but it's got problems. India, I think, is number 6.
I think it's fair to say it's a freer nation though than China. To your point.
Yeah, for sure. But
not even close.
Right, but the fact that China is the largest supplier of American pharmaceuticals in terms of bulk, but number 7 in terms of value added, and a distant number 7. I mean, Ireland is just overwhelmingly, in terms of value, the big U.S. supplier. What that means is that the value of the Chinese, the pharmaceutical supply by China, are very low-valued things. Low-valued things are easy to produce. If China weren't producing them, some other country would produce them. What we get from China, being low valued, is stuff that it would be very easy for other countries to supply to us if China were so foolish as to stop supplying the stuff to us. So the concern over pharmaceuticals is vastly overblown because people mistake the really economically meaningless physical weight or physical measurements of pharmaceuticals from the economically meaningful value of the pharmaceutical products that we get. Now, to the national security question. As I mentioned before, even Adam Smith, who was a great free trader, recognized certain exceptions to the case for free trade. And the first one he recognized was what we call today the national security exception. I accept the national security exception. But like Adam Smith, I believe that when you restrict trade in order to strengthen the nation's military, or in the hope of strengthening the nation's military, maintaining the strength of the nation's military, that is an economic cost and not a benefit. Now, just because something has a cost does not mean it's not worthwhile. Everything we do in life has a cost, and we incur costs voluntarily.
Sure.
And so it may be a worthwhile cost to pay, but the first thing to recognize is not an economic boon. It's a cost we have to pay. Given that it's a cost we have to pay, we always have to ask, well, is it worthwhile? How far should we push it? Because at some point, that cost becomes potentially too great given the extra increment that pushing it further might give us in terms of further national security. Further national security. So yes, there is a national security exception. I accept it. But let's recognize, in addition to it being a cost, let's recognize also that it is very easy to abuse. Once you mention, okay, there's a national security exception, then every firm who wants to be protected from competition, and every firm wants to be protected from competition, is going to make some attempt to color itself as vital to the national security. And the representatives of those firms, whatever locations they happen to operate in, they will be willing to go to Congress and make the case. Yes, my constituents who produce widgets, though widgets are essential to national security. So we have to be very leery of claims of national security. It cannot just be that the moment someone says national security, we say, okay, well, you're exempted, we'll protect you. And if we went down that road, we'd pretty much be an autarkic society. We wouldn't trade at all, and then we'd make ourselves very poor. Another thing to say about that, so there has to be some skepticism, healthy skepticism about national security claims. So we need some kind of mechanism in place, some trustworthy mechanism to separate out credible claims that an industry or a firm deserves national security protection from the spurious claims, which are going to be far more numerous than the credible claims. Mm-hmm. We also have to recognize that once you protect an industry, even if that protection is credible for national security, once you protect that industry's prices are going to rise. Mm-hmm. And so the current costs of acquiring things from that industry are going to go up. So let's forget about consumers having to pay higher prices. If the weapons suppliers have to pay higher prices, say for steel, that's protected for national security purposes. If they have to pay higher prices, then taxpayers are paying higher prices for new weapons systems that are built today. That may be worthwhile to do, to guarantee a larger domestic supply of this material that we're presuming to be vital to national security, steel. But it's a cost. Also, when you protect an industry, you inevitably make that industry less innovative. There's nothing that spurs innovation, both in terms of coming up with new and better products and in terms of reducing cost of production than competition. Mm-hmm. By protecting a firm from competition, you diminish the competitive pressures on that firm. So it may be that the justified increment of national security protection that we get today from protecting the industry might be offset by the national security decline that we get in the future if that industry becomes less innovative. And so it could be if we don't protect the industry today, it could be that it goes defunct, and we say, okay, well, we should have protected it because we need steel. I'm just using steel as a hypothetical example.
Yeah, sure.
And so
sure. It's a good example though because it's happening.
A good example. Obviously, you don't shoot foam rubber at enemies. You shoot metal at them. And it's a judgment call. These are just trade-offs. Okay, we have to protect it today to make sure it doesn't go away, but we also have to recognize if we protect it, then it's going to become less innovative, and it may be that 10 years down the road, our steel industry, the kind of metals we're producing, are less materially advanced than they would be, less useful for military purposes 10 years down the road than they would be if somehow we didn't protect them and they managed to stay afloat and become innovative. Another thing to say, I'm not going to go through because we'd spend the whole time. I'm going to say two more things about national security. One is, three more things, but they're related. One is, you should always ask, can the good be stored? If the good can be stored at relatively low cost, then the thing to do is to allow free trade, and you buy the things at low cost from the low-cost foreign suppliers, and you store it. And then you shoot it back at the enemies if they attack.
Such a simple idea. Like it's kind of basic, simple concept here that seems like it'd be highly effective.
Not everything can be stored, or not everything can be stored at an economically viable cost, but at least it's a question that should be asked. So, rather than go down the road of protecting a firm from competition, which diminishes its competitiveness over the future, if we have a better option, storing it, well, let's at least it should be looked at. But the people who say national security, they very seldom mention this. They think the only alternative is, if something is essential to national security, is okay. Well, let's protect the industry. A second related thing is that it's a thing that, again, the people who trot out the national security justification never mention, is to ask, well, what's the prospect of getting this good from a reliable ally? We're all making judgment calls. Nothing is certain in this world. Of course, we can't be certain of anything. But if a lot of our steel is coming from Canada and Mexico and Brazil, places that are allies to us, under no real prospect of being enemies, it may be the best thing to do. Okay, we can do without that domestic industry because we have good enough reason to believe that we can rely upon foreign suppliers who remain competitive in the world and remain innovative and allow us to get these things that, by assumption, are essential for our national security at lower prices than otherwise. Third and last thing I'll say about it is there is good evidence that the more we trade with another country, the less likely we are to get into a shooting war with that country. It doesn't guarantee. It's not the case at the moment we trade, one toothpick for a piece of bubble gum, we're forever at peace. Of course, that's not the case. But the greater the amount of integration, the lower the prospects of a hot shooting war. Mm-hmm. So, if a country goes overboard and closes its borders for the sincere purpose of making sure that it is less subject to being invaded in war, it might actually make a war more possible. Mm-hmm. In the case of Trump, I know we'll talk about the specifics later, it's insane that he is imposing tariffs on our allies. Canada is an ally. And when you drive an ally away, then we're not going to go to war with Canada. It's not going to go that far, obviously. But we have this ally, and this ally can potentially help us in any supplying in militarily significant inputs if a war with China or Russia ever does come. But by restricting trade with Canada, we diminish, I think, our national security preparedness. So there's more to say on that front, but as you can see, there are a lot of considerations that most people just don't think of. Their minds just go blank or dead, or they stop when the terms national security are uttered. So, well, end the story. Let's protect, and that cannot.
We have to do this. Yeah.
That can't be the end of the story. But yes, to circle full back, there is an exception that all respectable free traders, including me, assuming I'm respectable, grant. I'm willing to say the set is not null. There's a positive number of industries in certain circumstances in that set that might warrant protective tariffs on the basis of better ensuring national security. But we have to be very careful in defining that set and making sure we don't go too far in expanding it.
Well, I often think of the economic interdependence that exists between trading partners, because you can put a monetary value on whether you fire a missile at a foe, right? So billions, if not trillions of dollars are going between the United States and China. And so there is a real economic calculation, a rational economic calculation that can occur for a nation like China before they actually engage in an act of war, because they will quickly recognize that ultimately the American consumer in many ways butters their bread. And they may say, I would rather not spark a war with, even though we may view America, I'm speaking as the Chinese, we may view America as a foe. I'm not going to attack them because this could devastate our economy and lead to all kinds of other issues. And was it the economy?
Go ahead.
Was it Bastiat who said, when goods trade borders, armies don't?
Actually, Bastiat never. There's no record that Bastiat said. He certainly made arguments that suggested, but he never came up with that line either in French or in English. That line is traceable to a man named Otto. No one knows this guy, and this is the only thing I know about. A guy named Otto Mallory, who was an assistant to Secretary of State Cordell Hull during the FDR's administration.
No kidding.
Cordell Hull was, even though he was Roosevelt's Secretary of State for a long time, 12 years, nearly 12 years, Cordell Hull, maybe just over 12 years, Cordell Hull was an odd New Dealer. He was obsessed, I think healthily, with free trade. So he surrounded
Not what wouldn't have expected that one, by the way.
Yeah, and Cordell Hull was a great man, in my view, and he surrounded himself with lieutenants who shared his belief both that trade is economically good and that it's a force for peace. And this guy Otto Mallory was one of his. I can't remember his exact title, but he was a member of the Department of State employee under Cordell Hull many years ago, and he's the one that said that. But Bastiat never did, although Bastiat certainly would agree with it. Back to what you say. To summarize, it's just a bad business practice to shoot your customers or shoot your suppliers. Mm-hmm. And the more we're integrated, this is why. Well, it's one. I think there are two reasons why greater economic integration reduces, if it doesn't eliminate, but it reduces the prospects of a hot shooting war. One is purely self-interested. Right? You don't want to shoot your suppliers. You don't want to shoot your customers. Now, governments do all sorts of economically stupid things, so this is why trade doesn't guarantee peace. But a second reason is that when people trade, they just get to know each other better, and they become culturally more alike. Not identical, but culturally more alike. Our biggest trading partner is Canada. And we're very much like Canadians. We pronounce our O's differently, and, we're not quite as fond of ice hockey as they are. But the notion of us going to war with Canada is just lunatic. And not only because we trade a lot with Canada, but because we feel that they are part of our society. And I think...
Yeah, they are.
Of course they are. And so one of the beautiful things about trade is that it integrates people into a single society. And when you feel like you're part of a single society, the itch to go to war with them just isn't there. Again, it doesn't guarantee, and I'm not at all sure we're not going to go to war with China. Premier or President Xi, however his name is pronounced, he's an evil SOB, and his policies are really bad. But the fact is, when people say, well, we're so dependent on China for this, that, and the other, I mean, it may be, but that means that China is dependent on us for this.
Correct.
They're dependent. It's not a one-way street. And so if we stop trading with China and to reduce our dependence on them, well, we reduce their dependence on us. It has to work that way.
And, people make the argument that, well, China's, carries our debt. Well, China has significantly higher sovereign debt than the United States. And I've seen some estimates. I think it's hard to know exactly what the true debt to GDP ratio is, because getting data out of China is not exactly easy to do. Yeah. But I've read several credible sources. I believe it might have even been Bloomberg saying that debt to GDP ratio could have been as high as 300% in China. So they are holding very, very significant debt. So they too. It's not like they're just holding American tax, the American debt's bag here. It's more complex than that. I agree with you.
Let me just say one more about that.
Yeah.
China does hold a lot of U.S. by which I think you mostly mean U.S. Treasuries.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah. They're bondholders.
But this is a point that people should get clear, and I'm shocked at how often they don't. I know you know it, but China doesn't force the U.S. government to borrow. The U.S. government borrows because it is fiscally incontinent these days. Spending is fun, and taxing is not. And so it's domestic political influences that drive Congress, supported by the executive branch, to spend excessively. And when they spend excessively, they borrow. And the Chinese are among the borrowers. The Chinese don't force the American government to deficit spend. If the American government didn't deficit spend, the Chinese government wouldn't have any treasuries to buy. And so, you can't blame China for the fiscal incontinence of Washington. But many people do speak as if China is first of all, China's not even the majority of American debt's held by Americans.
Correct. It's actually quite a small fraction of it.
Yeah, but it's so easy to blame foreigners. Oh, look, China holds all this U.S. debt, and says this is a danger. Well, if they think it's a danger,
it's a scapegoat. It's a scapegoat.
All right, then to talk to Congress and tell them to become fiscally more responsible. Now that's an easy one to solve. Anyway,
so let's go back to trade for a second, because the national security question's always been interesting to me, and I'm with you. Like, I think there are moments that there should be reasonable exceptions, but like you, I'm always fearful that it's going to get abused, and oftentimes it does just straight up get abused, because you can sort of put yourself in pretzels justifying that anything under the sun could be of national security concern. Right. But back to specifically to tariffs. One question I have for you is there strong evidence that protectionist policies actually help the industry that they're trying to? So we all assume, right, and we've even assumed it in this discussion, that if we erect a tariff on, say, steel overseas, that it will by default necessarily create more jobs and be better for the steel industry. But one, does it actually help the steel industry? Is an effective way to do it? And two, are there unintended consequences for other manufacturers in the United States where it actually could harm them? Right. So the classic example, as you've written about and spoken about, quite often, is what people use steel as an input for the production of other goods. Yeah. So sure, maybe we're protecting some manufacturing jobs, because that's part of what's coming out of the Trump administration. And even the Biden administration was quite favorable to a lot of these ideas that you're seeing.
They kept most of Trump's tariffs and raised some others.
Correct. So this is relatively popular right now within Washington, D.C., and even within both parties. So, and there's certainly a lot of people within both parties that disagree with it, but there's a lot of mainstream politicians that are promoting it from both sides of the aisle. But the idea that it's necessarily going to create steel jobs, that's my question. Does it? And then secondarily, does it harm other manufacturers within the United States? And then I guess furthermore, and sorry to ask so many questions in one go here, but furthermore, the argument is to rebuild the American manufacturing base, right? That is often what you hear from most of these politicians. And the question is, are we actually, and what is the evidence that tariffs themselves and trade policy will actually rebuild the American manufacturing base here in the United States?
Those are all three good questions, and so I'm going to probably talk too long, so feel free to interrupt me. And
I better grab a bourbon under the table here. Settle in for a nice long conversation.
I presume that every tariffs don't emerge from nowhere. Tariffs always emerge from special interest group pressures. Right? You show me a tariff, I'll show you a domestic firm or industry that's behind it.
Sure.
So presumably they at least think that they will be benefited, at least in the immediate run, by the tariff. Mm-hmm. It's a good question. Overall, what effect have tariffs had on the performance of an industry? I think it's probably the case that the tariffs, when they're implemented, do increase output in those in the protected industries as they decrease output in other industries, and probably increase at least a little bit employment in those industries. That's for sure. As time passes, economics would predict that benefit gets less and less for reasons that we mentioned earlier. The firms are just less innovative and less competitive.
Well, sorry to cut you off. Let me give you an example. So let's say we put tariffs against ketchup.
Yep.
We might decide, you know what? I don't need ketchup. I like mustard. So I'm not going to buy ketchup. So therefore, if we've got ketchup plants in the United States, the ketchup plants, and we're like, you know what? No more Chinese ketchup. Not down with Chinese ketchup. So we put a tariff against it with the presumption that American ketchup manufacturers are going to take off. I might say, you know what? I'm a mustard guy myself, so maybe I'm biased, but I'm just going to go. And you know what? I don't need Dijon from France. Yep. I like American yellow mustard. So I'm going to go with the American yellow mustard. So one of the things I always wonder too is like, all right, so you can't get steel, right? Do we use plastic in a different way? Like, are we repurposing resins or other types of materials that could, and obviously it's going to be very difficult to replace something like steel or copper or aluminum, but do we work around it where maybe a particular industry doesn't see as much growth? And I know this is highly speculative, Don, but it's something I think about, and I've wondered if you all in the economics profession have thought through this as well.
Oh yeah, this gets into stuff. I'm not going to bore your listeners with the details, but this gets into what economists call elasticities of demand and cross elasticities of demand. Of course, we understand all this. The scenario you described is possible. One of the things that you learn when you study economics, almost anything is possible. And the vast majority of things that are possible will never, ever, ever happen. You know, it's possible that an elephant's going to fall through the roof and kill you right now. They're flying. But you're not really worried that it's going to happen, right?
Or I'm going to get hit by a plane sitting here.
Yeah.
It could happen.
It could. The possibility is not literally zero. But anyway, it could happen. But I think practically we can say it's not going to happen because presumably the American ketchup producers would understand that. And they would think, well, if we – basically what you're saying is if we raise our price at all, we're going to lose our entire market.
And we don't want to do that.
We don't want that. So yes, it's possible, but
steel's probably not going anywhere. To your point, Don, right? Like I get the practical reality. The steel has to be used in society. It's probably not being replaced by plastic.
Well, nothing has to be done, and there are almost always substitutes for something. There's aluminum can substitute for steel. Plastics in a lot of ways can substitute for steel. Carbon fiber can substitute for steel.
Sure.
Different kinds of steel can substitute for different, other sorts of steel. But on the employment front, I happen to remember the figures from 2018 when Trump imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum. Someone did the calculations, and there were for every worker in America who directly produced steel or aluminum, there were 36 workers in American factories that used steel and aluminum as a significant input. And so, I don't think there's any doubt that these tariffs help protect some jobs in aluminum and steel manufacturing plants. But by raising the prices of these metals, those tariffs reduce the demand, raise the cost of the firms that use those metals, and they had to cut back production, and so some jobs in those industries were lost, and probably a larger number of jobs in those industries were lost than otherwise. So people do say, your last question is the one I'm really eager to talk about.
Let's do it.
People do say, well, we need to. They do it in a couple of different ways, and you actually mentioned both. One is we need to bring back these jobs. Right?
Yep.
So it's true. And people will say, ever since China joined the WTO in 2001, the share of manufacturing employment has fallen in America. Ever since NAFTA was enacted in 1994, the share of manufacturing employment has fallen in America. Ever since America stopped running trade surpluses, the share of manufacturing employment has fallen in America. That's all true. The share of manufacturing employment in America has started falling before I was born, and I'm past the age of retirement. The manufacturing employment as a share of non-farm employment hit a peak during World War II. It dropped at the end of the war. It kind of leveled out until 1954, and in 1954 it started falling pretty steadily. It's fallen pretty steadily ever since, and it's falling steadily not because of trade. It's falling steadily because of labor-saving technology. And there are various studies done that try to tease out how much of the decline in manufacturing employment is due to trade, how much is due to technology. And I think the best studies find something like 70 to 80% of the decline in U.S. manufacturing employment is caused by technology and not by
automation.
Trade. Automation, yeah,
sure.
And so, if it were the case that American manufacturing jobs are being lost because American manufacturing and industry is being offshored, then we would see a decline in American manufacturing output and industrial output. We don't. So we constantly hear, I think literally not a day goes by when someone doesn't say, our industrial base has just been hollowed out by trade. Well, if you look at the facts, and they're not hard to find, America's industrial capacity is today at an all-time high. Our capacity to produce industrial outputs is today at an all-time high. Much higher than it was in 2001 when China joined the WTO, even higher than when NAFTA took effect in 1994, and even higher than it was in 1975, the last year America ran an annual trade surplus. And it continues to go up. It blips, but it today is at an all-time high. If you look at American industrial output, today at an all-time high. It is simply untrue that we don't make things anymore. We make lots of things. What we don't do is snap together final consumer goods. You see all these labels on consumer goods. You go to Target, you buy stuff from Amazon, you go to Walmart, and you see these
Made in China.
Made in China.
Made in Taiwan.
Those labels are today utterly meaningless. Largely, what they mean either one of two things. One thing they can mean is, where was this finally assembled? And so if you take the iPhone, I have an iPhone right here. It's made in China. I forget the exact percentage. The overwhelming percentage of the value of this comes from America. But it was all finally snapped together in China, and so it's considered to be a Chinese import from an American import from China. It's mostly made in America, but the label says made in China. Meaningless. A more meaningful label today would be made on Earth, given that the vast, and this is the economist Dan Ickes, it's not me, but it's correct. Made on Earth. Almost everything that we consume today, this is one of the beauties of the modern global economy, is the product of ideas and physical inputs that come from all over the world, and they cross borders and go back and forth, and they're finally snapped together in some location, and it's in that location where you get the made in labels. Snapping together things is a really low value added task, which is why poor countries tend to do those tasks. So, which is
That's a phenomenal point. This is a phenomenal point, Don.
it's not original to me, but it's an important point to make.
But it's good for my listeners to hear this because so much misconception comes from this. Keep talking.
When you walk into a Target and you buy a Keurig coffee machine, I don't know where it says made. It's not going to be made in America. Made somewhere. You can be sure lots of the first of all, probably the design idea for that came from an American, which wouldn't have happened had it not been for the opportunity to get low-cost inputs to make that design idea real. But some of the inputs came from America. Some of the inputs came from countless different countries. And they all wound up in this, let's say it was Turkey. I'm just making this up now. Made in Turkey. It was snapped together in Turkey. But it doesn't mean, so it says made in Turkey. But lots of it was made in America. I did a study a number of years ago, and some people have done similar studies more recently. I did a study now 13, 14 years ago, looking at a Jeep Wrangler and finally assembled in America, and a Toyota Camry, finally assembled in Japan. And you pick the thing apart. And what we discovered is that the Toyota Camry was more American, even though it was made in Japan, than was the Jeep Wrangler, even though it was made in America. Because these things come from all over the world, and so this made in stuff, it's meaningless today. But people fret about it because I still people say, I walk into Walmart and I don't find anything made in America. Well, in fact, you do find a lot of things made in America. You don't find any labels that say made in America because a lot of those labels, they're misleading. Much of what is in, it could be very well be the cotton in the towels that you buy at Target or Walmart very well may have come from Texas, but it says made in Turkey or made in Malaysia. But it could be that the cotton was grown in Texas, and quite often it is. And so we forget this. But the fact is, America's industrial base has not been hollowed out. Again, it's never been as high as it is today. And by today, I mean February of 2025, where the last statistics come out. We still manufacture a lot. Here's an interesting statistic. American manufacturing workers are by far add the most value to manufacturing output. The latest data that I saw, I think it's from 2019, so the numbers might have changed a bit, but I think in 2019, American manufacturing workers each worker had annual value added of something like $140,000. And China, the average manufacturing worker in China, had that annual value added of something like $20,000. I may be off a little bit on the numbers, but the magnitudes are there. Magnitudes are there. America's the value added of American manufacturing is enormous, and we do it with very few workers. And the beauty of this is that by requiring so few workers in manufacturing, we can let workers produce services. Now, people have a bad opinion of the service sector. So, this. But so here's a fact, and I forget the exact date, but it's been well over a century that the American service sector has been the single largest sector in the American economy over agriculture and over manufacturing. We've been a service sector economy for over a century.
That's wild to me to think about that, because I never would have assumed that would be the case. I mean, even farming, you would have assumed that it would have been a overwhelming part of the U.S. economy 60 years ago. So it's eye-opening to hear that.
Depends how you divide up the economy, but if it's divided into agriculture, manufacturing and mining, and services, it's a common way to do it, then I think it's like around 1911. Don't quote me on the exact year, but it's around that time where the service sector became the single largest, in terms of value add, contribution to GDP. the service sector.
You said around 1911. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
That's just remarkable to me. I never would have guessed that.
Ages ago. And then so you look at employment. I teach at George Mason University. I love teaching college. None of my students are in college because they want to become manufacturing workers. They all
right.
They all want to work in the service sector. My dad, who dropped out of school in 6th grade, worked as a bus driver and then for most of his career as a pipe fitter in a shipyard. I loved my father. He was a good man. If I had told my father when I was a young man, Dad, I'm going to drop out of school and I want to be a manufacturing worker like you, he would have thought me nuts. He
would have hit you over the head with a pipe.
He would have hit me over the head with one of his pipes.
That's right.
Get your butt back to school. People want their children to grow up to be service sector workers. There's nothing wrong with manufacturing jobs. Again, my dad was a manufacturing worker, and I loved him dearly, and he's dead now, but I respected him enormously. But people who pine for a return of the manufacturing jobs of 50 or 70 years ago, they have no idea what they're pining for. These jobs paid a pittance compared to what the typical American worker earns today. They were dirty. They were dangerous. They were unpleasant. They didn't. If they were so lovely, workers would have had a huge demand to work in them. Workers wanted to leave those jobs. Families wanted their sons and daughters to do better than working in those jobs. And it's in part because of that, because the service sector was a more attractive place to work, both in terms of the quality of the job and the pay, that manufacturers had to invest in labor-saving technology in order to continue to compete. And so as when a society gets richer, and this is not just true of America, it's true, when a society gets richer, what we see happening is the demand for services rises relative to the demand for goods. You don't want, as your income doubles, you don't double the amount of food you eat.
Nope.
So we do have, as we get richer, our demand for goods does increase, but our demands for services increases more. We want more medical care.
That is so true.
More entertainment. We want more leisure.
Yep.
We want more education. Our demand for services increases. And so as demand for services increases, that pulls workers into the service sector. That means that manufacturers, in order to keep their workers, they would have to pay higher wages. So I don't want to pay higher wages. And so what they do is they invest in labor-saving technology. That's an important driver of why American manufacturing today is such a high value-added proposition. Every manufacturing worker produces an enormous amount. Today in America, the manufacturing workers are about 8% of the labor force. 92% about 1% works in agriculture, about 90% work in services.
Are the trades included in that? Like, when you look at manufacturing, so say you're a carpenter or a plumber, like where do you fit in? Are you a service? That one feels gray to me. Are you a service worker? My dad's a retired, home remodeler, and so it's like, was he in manufacturing or was he in services? How would you calculate that?
It's a very good question, because ultimately, all labor is a service. I mean, when my dad worked in the shipyard, he was providing a service to the shipyard by fitting the pipe. Right? And so,
right.
And so
we can split hairs on the semantics of this, for sure. But
it's important because a lot does turn on how it's classified.
Sure.
And so my understanding is that what the government statisticians do, and I do think they work hard and they try to do as good a job as they possibly can.
Of course they do. Of course.
What they do is they look at a workplace, a plant, and if the bulk of what that plant produces and sells is a tangible output, that plant is classified as a manufacturing plant, and everyone who works in that plant is classified as a manufacturing worker. So even the
managers,
the managers are classified as manufacturing. Well, maybe management is separated out. I don't know for sure.
Okay.
But
okay.
But so they have a classification: production and non-supervisory workers. I know. So all of those workers are classified as manufacturing workers, and that would include even the typist. Well, typist, the receptionist at the desk of the vice president, the truck drivers who deliver if it's a steel plant, deliver the steel from this part of the plant to another part of the plant. They're all classified as manufacturing workers. If the bulk of what the plant does is services, all those workers are classified as service sector workers. So let's take a plant that, and for simplicity, let's assume it's single-owned firm. You got Drew's boutique steel making plant. And so you're making
high-end steel, baby. Here we go.
And so you hire some workers, to man the ovens, and but you also hire workers to drive the steel from your plant and
deliver
to your buyers. So those drivers are classified as manufacturing workers. And then let's say a year from now you say, I'm going to spin off. It's not worthwhile for me to hire those drivers. I'm going to contract out with I'll
go with a trucking company, third-party trucking company,
transportation firm. And so it could be the very same drivers that you were using now become employed with this transportation firm. And so it could be that nothing changed. You still produce the same amount of steel. You still transport the same amount of steel. But if
they're service workers,
they become service workers and not manufacturing workers. And so, how these data are collected and classified is not an insignificant issue. But they do change from time to time how they classify things, but that's relatively rare. And so these data have been gathered pretty consistently for pretty much the entire post-war era. And again, what we find is a steady decline since the mid-1950s in the share of workers in America employed in manufacturing, and an ever increasingly large number of workers employed in services. And all this time, we've become richer. That the protectionists want you to think that we're losing that our industrial heartland is being hollowed out, that we don't make things anymore, that workers are pining for manufacturing jobs, and none of it's true. None of it's true. You can't find evidence for it in any of the data.
Yeah, it's one of those giant misnomers, most definitely. Let's talk a little bit more about Trump himself. So going to the arguments, I want to talk just a teeny bit more about trade, and then I want to talk about other aspects of the Trump economic policy. One of the arguments, though, Don, so let's say we're all on the same page, that ultimately we're not really economic protectionists. We don't really want to try to protect certain sectors, which I do think the Trump administration is trying to protect some sectors of the economy. But let's assume it's a negotiation tactic. So one argument I've heard, and I've been really curious to get your opinion on this, is that, okay, Trump is frustrated, and a lot of members of his cabinet are frustrated because all of these other countries have been imposing tariffs on the United States, and it's done unfairly. And so the thought is, well, we're going to retaliate with a tariff. And then furthermore, we might even rack them up even higher. But that the end goal, and I've had many people say this to me, and I'm curious, and I've been sort of open to the argument, so I want to hear this from you, but that ultimately the end game is that it's a negotiation tactic, and it's really predicated on a deeper belief in free trade, that well, we don't want them to have tariffs, so we're going to punish them with a tariff in the hopes that all tariffs come down in the long run. So first question is, do you think that's an effective tactic? And then second question, do you actually think that's what the Trump administration is trying to do? Do you think there's elements of this where he is trying to engage in a negotiation tactic with them?
So to answer your first question, no, I don't think it's an effective tactic. It can't be ruled out theoretically. Even Adam Smith explicitly recognized that it's possible that if country A imposes tariffs on country B, then country B might be able to get country A to lower those tariffs by raising its own tariffs. Adam Smith himself didn't think it was an effective strategy for a variety of reasons. So I don't think it's an effective strategy. History doesn't provide a whole lot of evidence that it's an effective strategy. Trade wars are by far the most common outcome of raising tariffs. And I don't want to spend much more time talking about that, but no, it's not an effective strategy. Although again, it can't be ruled out in theory. As to the second question, I actually do. I'll give Donald Trump credit for this. I think he is a sincere protectionist. I don't think it's politics. The man has a 40-year plus record of saying exactly what he's saying today. The only difference is in the 1980s it was Japan. Today it's China. And so I think he genuinely believes that tariffs are a tool for enriching America. I think he genuinely believes that whenever America runs trade deficits, that we are being, as he would put it, screwed by foreign countries. This is all nonsense, but I think he genuinely believes it. I don't think Trump has any desire for free trade. I think he believes that America is going to be richer the higher are our trade barriers. Now, he may have to give in to political reality and say, well, you got to lower these under these circumstances. I'm having a brain freeze, Drew. I wanted to say something else in response.
We're just talking about does he genuinely believe in protectionist policies? Which I think it's hard to deny that he is clearly, thinks he can protect certain industries. But I do think there's elements that it is a bit of a negotiation tactic. Like I'll give for instance, I really doubt, and I got to tell you, if you want to see I know
what I wanted to say.
Okay, and then I'll share a thought when you're done. Go for it.
Yeah. So as you put it earlier, and this is how most people put it, but I think it's fundamentally wrong. But this is how Donald Trump thinks, how most people think. You say foreign governments impose tariffs on us. They don't impose tariffs on us. Foreign governments impose tariffs on their own citizens. A tariff is a tax on its own citizens. Now, It's true. It reduces the amount that our producers can sell to them. So it does have a negative effect on us. But the overwhelming bulk of that negative effect falls on the citizens of that country. And so when we retaliate against them, we're imposing taxes on us. Trade wars are wars in which one government says, I'm going to hurt my people more unless you stop hurting your people more. It's crazy. But Trump and a lot of people, he's not alone in this by any means. He thinks that tariffs on American exports are something that only damages us, not seeing that the bulk of the damage falls on the country that imposes those tariffs. And because the bulk of the harm of tariffs falls on the people of the country, of the government that imposes it, it's rather silly for our government to say, well, if that other country is imposing tariffs, we're going to impose tariffs on our people, and this makes us poorer.
Have you been watching the way the markets have been moving aggressively? Obviously, this impacts me.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that I'm against tariffs is ultimately I don't think it helps my end client. Are you watching the level of volatility within the stock market? Do you have any, I know you're not a financial guy necessarily, but do you have any thoughts on what you think the impact to the economy or financial markets could be?
So I'm not a financial guy. You know this better than I do, but I think my knowledge of economics can allow me to say some broad,
helpful things.
Yeah.
Correct.
So you'll remember when people woke up on Wednesday morning, November 6th, I think it was, after the election, on that day, the markets went way up. And I think because the markets realized, and they were breathing a sigh of relief, that Kamala Harris and her fellow progressives, were not going to be in charge of the government. That's a good thing because they did have, and they would have imposed a lot of destructive policies, higher taxes, more regulation. A lot of what Trump promises is, in fact, stuff that I favor. Now, it's stuff that I think almost any decent Republican would favor. Reduced regulation. It's unclear how committed Trump is to reducing government spending. He's got this Doge thing going, but I'm not confident that Doge is going to make a huge. I approve of much of what it's doing. I question some of the manner in which it's going about doing it, but yeah. So deregulation, tax cuts, all good, all promote growth. I'm in favor of that. I think that the markets underestimated Trump's seriousness with tariffs.
They did.
Yeah,
I was one of them, by the way.
So when he became,
I thought that would be minor.
Yeah, because his bark on the tariff front was smaller than his bite during his first term. It was big, but it was smaller than his bite. The bark now is turning out to be as big as the bite, and the bite's very big. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know when it's about 3 weeks ago or so when he really got rolling with this tariff talk, and that's when the market started to tank. You would know better than I. I think that I know it's up today because he's now tamping down some of the tariff talk. Well, it was down close to 10% at one point, wasn't it? The broader markets down.
The broader markets from peak to trough, we did hit a correction on the S&P 500, and we nearly hit a bear market on the Nasdaq when the tariffs talk started to ramp up. Probably for and of course, by the way, if you want to do a put on the market, and this is not advice, any regular listening, this is a joke. Follow my vacation schedule, because anytime I go anywhere and try to enjoy myself, the markets do this to me. And so I'm trying to enjoy myself in Florida, and I found myself by the pool as my kids are swimming, writing a long market commentary on the impact of trade policies on the stock market. So thank you for spoiling my vacation, people in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and the reason, I think the reason is, you alluded to one of the reasons earlier. Far more than in the past, in the pre-World War II level of globalization, the world is so economically integrated today that when you pull on one string, you have no idea what sort of economic consequences you're unleashing, and that ignorance is scary to investors, I'm sure. Trump is pulling on these strings. That's going to raise the cost. Over half of, depending how you measure, but the conventional measure, which I'm content with, over half of American imports are inputs used in American production. Over half. And so if that's the case, then Trump is...
So these aren't finished goods. Like, this is a really important part. I'm going to stop you.
Capital goods.
Yeah, so it's not like we're just bringing in lots of finished products like iPhones from abroad. We're bringing in, so half, that is amazing to me. Half of what we bring into the United States is used as an input for the manufacturing or the production of another product.
Yep.
That is
more than
that is huge. That's huge.
It is huge. Again, one of the many myths that people have about trade is that what we import is just all cheap consumption goods, and so if we raise tariffs, well, we'll just have to pay higher prices for T-shirts and trinkets. That's not the case. If all we were importing were T-shirts and trinkets, then if you raise tariffs, then we'll just be producing more imports and T-shirts and trinkets. But yeah, over half of our imports today are inputs. And you cannot gratuitously raise, as these tariffs are doing, these costs without finding negative effects in the financial markets. And that's a huge reason. I think the uncertainty is another reason. But it's a huge reason why the financial markets are pointing southward generally, because firms don't like to have their costs unnecessarily raised.
I also, my hope too is that there's a little bit of market discipline that would kick in for the Trump administration when it comes to trade policy. That it's like, hey, look, the markets are speaking. The markets are also, particularly the equity markets, are pretty predictive in their ability of helping us understand. It's a forward-leaning indicator, right? Yep. Of helping us understand where the macroeconomy is going, because really the stock market is a measure. To put it very crassly, the stock market, in my estimation, is a measurement of where we think businesses are going over the next call it 6 to 12 months. And in fact, in my research on this, what I found is typically the stock market leads the actual GDP data by about 9 months. And so it's sort of raw emotion. Like I think the markets are highly rational in the long run. I think the stock market is extra. I believe, I don't believe in the efficient markets hypothesis. It's a little bit too crazy for me. But I do believe that markets are highly efficient and highly rational. But in the short term, they're also highly emotional. And so they're reacting to the whims of whatever we think X policy will be in the future. The thing about it, and it's not that investors are irrational, to the Daniel Kahneman lovers of the world. It's not that markets are irrational, participants are irrational. We're just responding to the information that is constantly changing. Yep. And we see this throughout various administrations where, particularly with the Trump administration, where day to day, in fact, if, I opened my FactSet terminal today, I call it my Christmas tree because it's lots of red and green. And today it's a whole lot of, the Christmas tree's got a lot of green on it. And the markets, the NASDAQ this morning was up like 2%. And that was because now there's talk that Trump's going to not put near as many tariffs on the markets. And so the markets are emotionally responding in the moment. The problem, though, is that if he changes his mind or if a commerce secretary changes his mind, et cetera, then all of a sudden the markets can react down again. We're just always responding to this information. My hope, though, is that information is trickling, because at a certain point you would think that it becomes a vote of negative confidence or no confidence, however you would say it, and that maybe people would course correct. I also got to assume this is not a traditionally Republican position, a protectionist policy, at least maybe more so in the near term. But I haven't tended to hear a lot of sort of old school traditional Republicans advocate against free trade. A lot of them advocate for free trade. And what I'd be curious to know is if there's infighting at all when it comes to these economic policies. I can think of a dozen Republican lawmakers that I know would absolutely and fundamentally disagree with this type of policy. My hope is that maybe some practical political reality kicks in. This is why I'm not overly pessimistic about the future either. Is I'm not convinced that all this is going to hold. Do you disagree? I mean, what is your take about the future outlook of this?
So let me say, I'm given that I'm not a financial economist, I'm very happy to learn that you, who know more about financial markets than I do, have pretty much the same position about financial markets as I do. I'm not a believer in the efficient markets hypothesis, but I do believe that over the long run, financial markets are about as rational as markets get, and I think
100%
get pretty rational, and they are forward looking. I mean, you have people spending their own money, and lots of it, and they have an incentive to get it right.
It's about as flippin' rational as you could ever get. So with all due respect to the behavioral economists, you're wrong. And markets are hyper rational. And when you put money and you have skin in the game, they become even more rational. Absolutely. I can say whatever psychobabble I want when I'm on CNBC or Fox Business or Bloomberg. But when I'm investing real dollars as an investor for my clients, or my clients are investing their real dollars, they're not just like nut jobs at the psych ward. They are very methodical. And as someone who's worked with the public, I can tell you it is methodical and highly rational in most instances.
Yeah, you can't. You as an investor,
I could go on.
You can't afford to let your ideology or emotions get in the way. Sometimes they might, but by and large they don't. And investors who survive are ones who manage to tamp all that down as much as possible.
Correct.
So markets are forward looking. I certainly believe that. I do hope. I'm not sure I'm as optimistic as you, but I see a case for it. I do hope. So we know that Trump believes that the financial markets like him. I mean, after the election, he was boasting about, well, look what happened to
called it the Trump put.
Right? Yeah, and so he's got to be worried about. Well, let's see. Every time I announce more tariffs, the financial markets tank. When I ease up on them, they go up. Maybe that's telling me something. A few weeks ago, when this happened, he and some of his advisors then said, "Oh well, it's they're falling now, but our policy, it's going to have some short-term pain, but for long-term gain." But the problem with that is markets are long-term looking. If in fact investors believed that these tariffs would impose only short-term gain that would be more than offset. Short-term pain that would be more than offset by long-term gain. The stock market would rise today. Like, fantastic. And so precisely because markets are forward-looking, the fact that they fall when tariff hysteria gets higher, when Trump talks more about imposing more tariffs, that tells me that these investors are looking forward and saying, well, these tariffs are not going to be good for the economy. Mm-hmm. And hopefully Trump and his lieutenants will pay attention to that. But again, I believe he sincerely believes in tariffs. I think it's an ideological position that he has. And so that might work against his believing, who's taking the advice of what the financial markets are trying to tell him.
Like any administration, though, there is a mixed bag. Like you and I obviously are quite critical of the idea of trade policy. And I appreciate a lot of the really sincere people out there that I think it's coming from a good place. These are not bad people that advocate for trade policy like this. You and I know, though, just factually and just from a look at history, you way more than me, that trade policy, particularly the use of tariffs, is not an effective tactic, and it doesn't make us richer; it makes us poorer. Yep. That said, every administration is indeed, though, an economic mixed bag, and so there's aspects to the current administration that I think could bolster growth. Are there aspects to this administration that are giving you maybe some encouragement that you think, okay, this could be good for the economy over the long haul?
Oh yeah, I mean, I do think that the administration's natural hostility to government regulation is a good thing. Mm-hmm. I think the government regulation is and has for a long time been far too extensive. I'll mention one outstanding appointment. Trump's appointment of Paul Atkins to be chairman of the SEC is just fantastic. Paul Atkins is
I love it.
Great guy. I mean, he and compared to what came before him, I mean, and so that's good. I think the skepticism of taxes is good. Mm-hmm. I do worry, as I said before. I wish the administration would be a little bit more Reagan-esque, at least in its talking, its language about spending. Mm-hmm. There are a handful of fronts in the regulation. There are a handful of pieces of the regulation angle, mixing my metaphors, that I worry about. I think the Trump administration is not as good on antitrust as it should be, as a typical Republican administration would be. It's much more Biden-esque on the antitrust front than it is Reagan-esque on the antitrust front. And I have no doubt that the Reagan-esque approach is much better than the Biden-esque or Obama-esque approach. But overall, yes, the regulatory stance, the tax stance, all good. On economic policy, it's the trade policy that is the gigantic. It's not a fly in the ointment; it's a gigantic desiccated rat.
Okay.
in the ointment, and it's poisoning a lot of what he is trying to do. It's going to tamp down a lot of the growth. We have data. If you look at Trump's first term tariffs, and which were milder than these tariffs, in 2017 and 2018, the rate of economic growth picked up. The annual rate of economic growth picked up. And 2018 is the year Trump started imposing his tariffs. In 2019, the rate of economic growth fell. It was still positive, but it was much lower than it was in 2018. You can't say anything about 2020 and 2021 because it was COVID, so those numbers are economic.
Those are outliers, and spurious.
Yeah, but if the tariffs were pro-growth, then you would have expected that they would have hypercharged the pro-growth deregulation and tax-cutting policies that he implemented in 2017. In fact, what we see, if we look just at GDP growth, those tariffs dampened that growth. And I don't think that's a statistical anomaly. I think the statistics here reflect the underlying economic reality that while the deregulation and tax cuts were good for the economy, the tariffs diminished the amount of good that they were doing for the economy.
Did you write a piece about that point with Phil Graham in the Wall Street Journal?
Yeah, in fact, I got it.
This rings a bell.
Yeah. I can't. We've had several pieces over the past several months in the journal, and I can't remember which piece it was in, but it was in. We did have that in one, and that's a piece of data that he dug out.
Because I remember this maybe even 2 years ago. You had wrote something maybe 2023.
Yeah, I think it was our early, so the first piece we had was in the fall of 2023, and it may have been in the very first piece that we wrote. And I didn't even realize this until Phil told me. He said, look at the annual rate of GDP growth, and oh wow, it was lower in 2019 than it was in.
How much lower? I don't want to keep you. I don't want to hold you up too much longer. But what was the deceleration in the GDP growth?
I don't remember exactly offhand, Drew. It was something like. So you can please do not quote me on the exact numbers, but I know it's true. On the left-hand side of the decimal point, the rate of GDP growth in 2018 was something like 2.3%, 2.4%, maybe 2.7%. The rate of GDP growth in 2019 was something like 1.9 or 1.7%.
Yeah.
So it declined. It doesn't seem like a lot, but if you were to extend that decline in growth over many years, it becomes significant after a while. But the point is, if the tariffs were to help, because that was the big change in 2018 was the tariffs. If they were to be also pro-growth as his earlier policies were pro-growth, then we certainly wouldn't have seen a fall in GDP. But that's what we saw. We expected to see a rise in GDP, but in fact we saw a fall in the rate of growth.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I heard I met with one of the representatives from one of the big asset managers this morning, and they said that their economists are predicting about I want to say, again, don't quote me on this either, but 0.2 to 0.4% shed off. I think it was closer to 0.2 shed off of GDP growth as a byproduct of a lot of these tariff proposals. And you're right, like over time that can take off. Now I will say this, and this is maybe where I'm a little more optimistic, and I don't know the future by any means. I'm also not convinced that we're heading into like the pit of sort of recession hell here either.
I'm not either.
What we could, right? And I want to clarify that for listeners. It's really easy for people to get depressed when they hear this conversation. So if you are an investor, I want to give you some encouragement. I personally, and I know you're not. We're not suggesting that we are on the precipice of some big crisis. That's not at all what we're saying. What I think, and I'll let you speak. I mean, what is your take on that?
One thing I've learned, maybe the biggest lesson I've learned over the past 40 years, going from being a young assistant professor economist to being now way too senior. But I have.
You look great, Don. You're aging well, my friend.
Thank you. I have learned that the market is an incredibly robust institution. The American market, in particular, it's very entrepreneurial. You're probably too young to remember this, but there was an old Timex commercial back in the 60s and 70s with a spokesman named John Cameron Swayze, and his line was, "Timex, it takes a licking but keeps on ticking." We show the thing fall off a cliff, right? And the market is very like it takes a licking, but it keeps on ticking. Now, at some point you can lick it too much, you can kick it around too much, and it's going to stop. But the market's very robust. Trade, depending on how you measure, trade is no more than 20% of our economy. So, because we're a big, dynamic,
complex,
continental economy. And so we Americans are entrepreneurial. Our markets are still largely free. There's way too much intervention for my taste, way too much taxes, but we're still largely free. Property rights are still relatively secure. There's freedom of entry. Our financial markets are astonishingly robust and efficient.
They are.
All of this contributes to the American market being able to overcome lots of abuse. Now, it would be better if this abuse weren't there, and we'd be even better.
Sure.
And so I don't think that the tariffs, as bad as they are going to throw us into a recession. They're going to reduce economic growth and make us poorer over the long run than we otherwise would be. But my gosh, so I can be optimistic. The robustness of the American entrepreneurial market is a thing to behold. It's just astonishing. If I get anxious at night and can't sleep and I want to sleep, look at how robust the American market is and has always been. And so at the end of the day, I am an optimist because we
Me too.
To be an entrepreneurial people. We continue to be a people who respect entrepreneurs. We accept creative destruction and economic change. Mm-hmm. We honor people who make good in business and who perform their commercial activities with honor. And that's all to the good. That keeps our economy humming along, and you have tariffs, you have tax, you have regulation trying to knock it down, but it keeps bulldozing forward, and so that gives me hope. That enables me to go to bed at night knowing that when I'm gone, and my son is still around. My son's 30, almost 40 years younger than me. That he'll live in an economy that's even wealthier than the one that I live in now, and continues to be entrepreneurial.
I think it's really great. It's a great way to end the conversation today. I appreciate the optimism because, like you said, I am highly optimistic despite some disagreements I may have with the trade policy. I still think the American economy is robust. And to your point, the entrepreneur is so dynamic and nimble. Even in my industry, the amount of financial innovation that is filled in the gaps. So I'll give you one really interesting example. And Scott Bessent, the current Treasury Secretary, actually said this in a recent interview, is I've been fascinated by the lack of credit for borrowing, particularly for companies. So credit markets, in my opinion, have been a little bit restricted. And this happens, right? Like after the 2008 and 2009 financial crisis, where banks were over-levered, where lending standards were way too soft, which, oh, by the way, and I interviewed Charles Calamiris on this podcast.
Charles is a great guy.
Yeah, it was an amazing interview. Yeah. And but his book, by the way, really
Fragile by Design.
Fragile by Design. Great. By the way, if you're a nerdy person and you want to know about this stuff, that is, I think, the gold standard on understanding the banking system. It's the absolute gold standard.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a great opus. So nonetheless, in the book, one profound point that was made is that Scotland was, and he said this on the podcast, that Scotland at one point, backwoods, hillbilly Scotland, versus the English, their financial industry was just crushing what the English were capable of doing, their banking system. And that's because they had a sufficient amount of lending, where the Bank of England was really tamping down on lending. And one of the things that was a light bulb that went off for me, because I think sometimes as sort of wise financial people, we just assume that less lending and less borrowing is good for an economy. But actually, some of the most autocratic governments have the least amount of lending. In fact, they have very, very little lending. I mean, countries like North Korea and Venezuela will pop up where they have a lack of access to capital. I think you could take some of those macro principles where there's a point at which there's over borrowing, over leverage, right? Too much credit within the system, which would be the pre-financial crisis in the United States. And then there's markets where there's too little. And I'm worried that the spectrum has shifted from before and after as a byproduct of the Dodd-Frank financial reform bill, where there's a lack of sufficient credit. I say all this long diatribe because the banks are not lending to corporations to the extent that they used to. What happened, Don? Investment firms started to come around the corner and say, we will lend to you outside of the traditional banking system. Yeah. Right? And so the markets where credit needed to be found, credit occurred. But Scott Bessent's point, which I thought was a fair point, was he thought private credit was a very fascinating space. It's a space I'm quite familiar with as well. He said, he'll always, I mean, I think he believes, and I certainly believe private credit would always be around. But the fact that private credit has had to get so big is a direct market response to the fact that traditional banking has been too restrictive and the pendulum swung to the other extreme. I say all that because there is so much dynamic financial innovation where businesses now have access to capital where they can innovate and be productive. So despite the damaging impacts of bad government policy, you find markets still wiggle around and find a way to just make it happen.
Yep. Look, Sarbanes-Oxley, 20-something years ago, and Dodd-Frank in 2010. I mean, these really were bad. I wish they would be repealed.
Me too.
They are terrible obstacles to efficient markets. But to your point, the American entrepreneur, the American sense
finds a way.
Let me get around. Let me mention just one. There's the one thing markets cannot tolerate are price controls.
Yes.
When our leaders, if ever our leaders start talking about price controls, and this is by the way one benefit of the Trump people over the Harris people. Remember one of Kamala Harris's proposals was she was going to impose price.
I do remember this. Right? Yeah.
But history is utterly clear on this.
It's ruthless.
To the extent that you impose price controls, you will cripple an economy because you can't get around them. They're almost impossible to get around. Prices set by markets are the essential information source that both inform and incite entrepreneurs and investors to do what they have to do to keep the economy humming. And if price controls are put in place, the economy will collapse. Fortunately, those aren't in place, and all these other things we have in place, including tariffs and Dodd-Frank, these are bad, but entrepreneurs are allowed or able to get around them. And thank heavens for the profit motive. Thank heavens for. I love it, and I applaud the creativity and the ingenuity and the gumption of these people to do that, and I hope they keep doing it.
Amen, brother. Don, thanks again. Another just fabulous conversation. I always love talking to you.
Hey, it's my pleasure, Drew. It was great talking to you as well.
If you've enjoyed this content and you're looking for a wealth advisor, or if you're a financial advisor and you're looking to make the jump to the independent side, please message me on LinkedIn, or you can email me at drew.benson@bensonwealthmgt.com, or lastly, you can call my office at 603-316-2544. Securities offered through Raymond James Financial Services, Inc., member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services are offered through Raymond James Financial Services Advisors, Inc. Benson Wealth Management and True North Wealth Management Group are not registered broker-dealers, and they are independent of Raymond James Financial Services. The foregoing information has been obtained from sources considered to be reliable, but we do not guarantee that it is accurate or complete. It is not a statement of all available data necessary for making an investment decision, and it does not constitute a recommendation. Any opinions are those of myself and not necessarily those of Raymond James. Expressions of opinion are as of this date and are subject to change without notice. There is no guarantee that these statements, opinions, or forecasts provided herein will prove to be correct. Investing involves risks, and you may incur a profit or loss regardless of strategy selected.